Welcome to the Ask the Geographer podcast series, brought to you by the Education Department at the Royal Geographical Society with IBG. I'm Rachel, your host, and in each episode I'll be joined by geographers from across the globe to delve into current events, publications and research, all tied to the fascinating world of geography. Our oceans cover over 70% of the planet, yet, despite their vastness, there are still parts we know little about. As geographers, our focus traditionally has been on the coastline, often overlooking the intricate role oceans play in climate regulation and biodiversity. However, for us to deepen our understanding of oceans, we must forge meaningful connections with them. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Rachael Squire and Professor Kim Peters, who are undertaking pioneering research into the social connections humans have with oceans. Their work, in collaboration with Royal Holloway University London, seeks to unravel the relationship between humanity and the marine environment. Rachael, Kim, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us. It's lovely to be here.
It's a pleasure.
So, could you please provide us with a brief overview of your work so far?
Yeah, I would start by saying that we both love the ocean and we both have a history that brings us close to the seas and oceans in different ways. For me, particularly by the shoreline. So as I've written in some of my work, I'm actually not a good swimmer, but that doesn't mean that you can't build a connection and a love to the seas and oceans. And so in our work, we've become very interested in how the seas are represented and understood. And we've both been working on the seas and oceans separately and also together for some time. But really, to give you an overview of our work, we're interested in the seas and oceans from a human perspective. So this is rather new to geography, well, new in the last 20 or so years especially. Many listeners may be familiar with the seas and oceans from a physical geography point of view. So when we think about the currents, the tides, sea level rise, the impacts of pollution. But of course, the seas and oceans are also, as our work has explored, spaces of society, of culture, of economics and of politics. Lives are also lived at sea. And this side has often been quite ignored in human geography, and this is mainly because people live mostly on the land. It's also a space that's sometimes harder to study. But Rachel and I have been looking at the deep linkages between people and the seas in different ways. The way that we, society, organise the oceans, maybe into zones from the territorial sea to the deep sea, the way we use the sea for military gain, resources, energy, and the way the sea's also part of cultures, particularly for some coastal nations. So my work is sort of situated in this turn towards the ocean, and Rachel's work too. And for me particularly, in my research institute, I work over in Germany at the moment, but keep deep ties to the UK. I explore the governance of the seas and oceans, how we route ships, for example, how the seabed may be mined in the future. And then my most recent work with Rachel that looks at the space of the aquarium and how it can help us grasp ocean worlds.
Thank you, Kim. Just to add to that, my work really picks up on or is situated within this oceanic turn that Kim has talked about. So this resurgent and renewed interest in the oceans within human geography. So whether you're at school or at university or wherever you are kind of crafting your interest in geography, it's a really exciting time to be thinking about the oceans from a human perspective. And my work has done this through various different kind of historical projects with a particular focus on the Cold War and thinking about how people understood the ocean as territory during that time and not just a space to kind of cross or ship over. I'm also really interested in ideas around immersion and what it means to be immersed within the sea. So I learnt to scuba dive as part of that process in a very cold lake in Raysbury, but then did subsequently take myself to the oceans to learn a bit more about that context. And then more broadly, I'm really interested in questions around the oceans and Earth futures. And that really ties back in to what Kim was saying about our current project, which is funded by the British Academy. And it's really thinking about the role and place of aquariums in how we think about environmental crisis today. So we want to understand how aquariums are curated, how they engage visitors, and really importantly, how they convey certain environmental messaging. Millions of people pass through aquariums every year. I'm sure many of us have been on school trips to aquariums, days out with family. They're these really kind of understudied and under the radar, I guess, touch points to the ocean. And for a lot of people, perhaps living in inner city spaces, it could be the only touch point that they have to the ocean for long periods of time. So we're really interested in understanding how they function as these spaces that connect people to the oceans and connect people to these spaces that might seem very abstract or distant from everyday lives.
Wonderful, thank you. I think, Kim, you've already touched a little bit about what's initially sparked your interest in the field, but is there anything else that really made you want to go into this area?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I mentioned previously that I'm not a great swimmer. So I was born and brought up in London, just outside of London, didn't have regular access to a pool. And I'm now an ocean or a maritime geographer. So I've always felt quite fraudulent, really, about that. But I think this is something that has sparked my interest in this field, because I think both for Rachel and I, we're also sparked by ideas of how we access different spaces. So I think we've been very interested in the idea that the sea is not just a space that's out there, it's out there in the distance, on the margins, something that is distanced from us. It's not just a geographical zone that is the blue on the map. We know and we access the sea in lots of different ways. We might do so through film, through TV, through magazines. Many of the people listening may be familiar with some documentaries about the ocean that might have been a really fantastic entry point to caring about the seas. So I guess we were sparked by this idea that the sea isn't this thing that's always very distanced. It may also be accessible via something like an aquarium, which brings the far away close to us. And that ties into really interesting geographical themes of proximity and distance, the near and the far. And so I wrote a paper a few years ago with my colleague Philip Steinberg that was about the idea that the ocean exceeds its boundaries. It can appear in the pages of a book, or when you hold a shell to your ear and you can somehow hear the sea. So I think really some of this interest has been sparked by, are there other ways we can access the sea and think about then how we understand the sea as a space that doesn't mean necessarily being in it? And I think that's really powerful. Many people in our world will never even see the sea. They will never see the sea. That doesn't mean that they can't care about it, that they can't love it, that they can't come to appreciate it in some way. And so having an interest in the ways in which we may make the sea accessible and how particular spaces, be they books, documentaries, but even aquariums, make the sea accessible, I think is really part of our interest. It's also deeply geographical because it is about, as I mentioned, the near and far, proximity and distance. But this project actually came about because of something very specific. So I don't know if you want to say more, Rachel.
I guess drawing together all of those ideas that Kim's just been talking about, the specifics of the project kind of came from a visit actually to Kew Gardens, which you might not immediately associate with aquariums, but we'd met there just to catch up and to talk about various different aspects of work. And after we'd had our mince pies on a very cold December day, we had a wander around Kew Gardens, and they have various aquarium tanks there. And it was really that moment that got us thinking about the role of the tank, the role of these spaces that bring the underwater into sight and that bring people literally into very close, Kim was talking about proximity, that literally bring people into very close proximity with not only different bodies of water, but their inhabitants, and to get people thinking about what kind of lies beneath the surface. Because not only will many people not visit the sea, an even smaller number probably will go under the sea. It's very expensive. It's very expensive to learn to scuba dive. It's very expensive to go on different experiences that might take you beneath the surface. So I think these spaces then become really, really important in literally surfacing something that would otherwise be completely inaccessible. And it was that trip that kind of sparked our interest in this. But as Kim said, it very much ties into those wider and really important questions around the idea of the ocean in excess. How does it travel? How is it placed in different locations? How can people experience it, even if it's not in their direct kind of location?
Yeah, I can see that. It's amazing how you've just talked about the fact that the borders have gone beyond the coastline. And I think we take it for granted being in a country that you're probably within, an hour from any type of seascape, that we're all going to be experiencing the sea. But I'm sure there's quite a few people around the world that won't necessarily have that access. So being able to see what's there really helps people engage with it.
Yeah, definitely. And a really interesting one as well, a couple of the sites that we visited were coastal locations, but they had real difficulties in getting people from perhaps more deprived areas within the cities that were nearby the sea to come out and experience the coast. So I think there's all sorts of kind of socio-economic challenges as well associated with connecting to the sea that perhaps I certainly assumed at the beginning of the project that people in Plymouth, people in Hull, for example, will be really interested in the sea, will be kind of visiting it every day, but that's often not the case, and that comes down to lots of other kind of geographical themes and questions.
So why is it, do you think, there's a disparity in the connection humans have with the oceans compared to the landscape?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think ultimately this comes down to, I'm going to give our listeners a little bit of an introduction to a nice piece. I've mentioned my colleague Philip Steinberg. In 2001, he wrote a book about the ocean that began to really, I think, and Rachel can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this book was really pivotal in shaping what we now know as sort of human geographies of the sea. And he was interested in how the ocean gets constructed in different ways, how societies have constructed it in certain ways to use it. So as a resource space to extract from, or as a zone to protect for environmental stewardship and so on. But in this book and in some of his aligned work, he says that the ocean is not a space of, and I'll quote him directly, a space of permanent sedentary habitation. And what he says, what he means by that is that people don't live at sea broadly. You know, we live with our feet on dry land. And because we live on land, we're mostly land-minded. We look into the land rather than out to the sea. And I think this fact that for the vast majority of us, not everyone, there are lots of people who do work at sea and spend their lives at sea. But for the most of us, we live on land. And so because of that, humans have more of a connection to the land. And that's certainly shaped sort of human geography as a discipline, really, because if human geography is interested in relationships between people, space and place, and we live mostly on land, it makes sense we mostly study the land, which is why this field has come a little bit later. But I think really that disparity in connection comes because we tend to be very land-minded. I mean, even that language of saying that the sea is on the margins or it's on the edge of the land, that centralizes the land. So I think it's a really interesting point about where we live mostly and where we spend our time, and also that sort of position that puts the land at the center and the sea on the edge.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Kim and I have also kind of discussed various different responses to that question, I guess, throughout the course of the project. Words like proximity, inaccessibility, and vision are also really, really important. Even if you are by the sea, it's likely that you're looking across it rather than looking through it or thinking through its kind of vast volume. But yeah, also worth noting, I think, that these perspectives that do create this distance and do situate the sea as a kind of marginal space or at the margins of land are very Western-centric ideas. Indigenous peoples from various different parts of the world don't make that distinction, and they see the sea as being kind of intimately and intricately connected with land. There's no kind of binary distinction as we tend to make in both Western scholarship and Western ways of thinking. So I think part of the challenge with this work and with ocean geographies more broadly is to think with and to learn from Pacific Islands scholars, for example, who articulate and think about the sea in very, very different ways. And I guess through the aquarium project, we're trying to, think about those questions of proximity, inaccessibility, vision, and to break those down in different ways through the space of the tank, through how certain experiences are curated. How are you, for example, when you're walking through the aquarium, prompted to experience a sense of awe or wonder or connection to a particular species or a connection to an ocean space? So yeah, really, really, really important questions, I think.
And it's fascinating how you've brought up that actually there are quite a few cultures that very much use and utilize the oceans as part of their culture, as part of rituals within their society. And I'm really excited to be able to explore different parts of that with you guys in the future. So, how do you see your research helping geographers understand ocean health and its connection with broader environmental issues?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. You hear this term sort of ocean health is used a lot today to think a little bit about how is our ocean maintained, how is it preserved, how is it also restored if it's been degraded, how can we have healthy oceans for healthy societies, but also how's that linked to broader issues such as climate change. These are all really critical issues right now. I mean, more broadly, in my own work, and also I think it rings true for Rachael as well, we also appreciate that ocean health and its linked to environmental issues mean different things for different people in different places in our world. And that's really important. It's not a universal experience. So there are some parts of the world that will be suffering the environmental impacts on their ocean health at much worse rates than other parts of the world. And there are relationships between those things. For example, some of the nations that might be have historically been responsible for climate change are not necessarily the ones that may be facing the biggest impacts of climate change. So there are unequal relationships, spatial and geographical relationships that are important there. But I mean, if we zoom in, we've talked a lot about our aquarium project because it's a great window for thinking about some of these questions. And I think what's really interesting in this question about how does our research help geographers to understand ocean health, the aquarium kind of shrinks the ocean, right, into a gallery or museum-sized space. And then what it also does is it helps highlight some of the main issues that are going on in the oceans right now. And so our work's been sort of helping geographers to think through what some of those issues are and their complexity. So, for example, one thing that we found in lots of aquariums that we've gone to is that they've raised the issues of ocean plastics. And they really highlight that as a critical issue. We went to one aquarium and it showed, for example, issues around endangered species, so what we call kind of red list species, and highlighting those. And so really, I think that our research in this aquarium project that we work on together, but also our broader work, it's to help people think through those complex relationships between people and the sea. And again, yeah, I mean, ocean plastics is a really complicated one because it's not simply that there's plastic in the ocean, it's finding its way into the ocean somehow. And again, that's also not an equal relationship. You know, not everyone's putting plastic into the ocean, and there's certain levels of responsibility there. And so the Aquarium Project helps us highlight some of those environmental issues, but also to think about how they're narrated. Rachael?
Yeah, I think it also, just building on what Kim said there, helps us think about questions of care as well. So there's a fantastic documentary series on BBC iPlayer by the National Marine Aquarium. And at the opening of each episode, Marcus, I think one of the curators at the aquarium, talks about how they want to get people to love the ocean, because if you love something, then you connect with it and you're more likely to engage with some of these big issues that can really seem very abstract and removed from our everyday life. We've talked about the fact that proximity is a big issue when thinking about why people don't think about the ocean or perhaps don't care about the ocean in the same way that they might other kind of landed environments, and the role of vision. You can't, for example, see coral bleaching. We can't see microplastics in Antarctica. These are all things that are very quite difficult to grasp and pin down. So I think one of the things we're really excited about with this project is the way that it explores how these spaces ask people to engage with these issues and ask people to care about them, whether that's having tanks, as is the case in one aquarium we visited, with bleached coral, so people can see what that looks like and what we kind of stand to lose if that continues. Or the National Marine Aquarium, for example, have a fantastic display about plankton, which again, something that we don't really think about, or certainly doesn't attract the interest like sharks or turtles or these other kind of charismatic species do, but are nonetheless absolutely fundamental to ocean health and to our health as as humanity and as landed beings. You know, the oceans are absolutely integral to everything we do and to how we live our lives. So yeah, we hope that the project can start making those connections and to get, I guess, people thinking about those scalar questions through the smaller spaces of aquariums.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, you've touched on quite a big point there where aquariums are effectively the windows to the ocean that people can have access to in kind of snippets. Could you talk more about how the aquariums have helped you with your research so far?
Yeah, so we have been to a whole range of different aquariums. We spent a lot of time in aquariums over the last kind of 12 to 18 months, and they've been really, really pivotal. We found a very generous community among aquarium workers, whether they're volunteers, curators, aquarists who are responsible for looking after all the marine life that's contained within them, whether it's people that are involved in education and outreach. I think what we have been really pleasantly surprised by is the passion that underpins these spaces, whether they are aquariums run by charitable organizations or kind of big corporations. The staff that work in these spaces really, really do care and have been extremely generous to us in helping us understand the role of these spaces in picking up on some of those questions that we've already mentioned. So there's a real sense through these spaces that people want to build ocean citizenship, ocean literacy, to get people engaging and thinking through with some of the most pressing contemporary challenges of our time, but to do so in a way that is accessible, that doesn't alienate people, that can create a sense of fun and awe and wonder whilst also picking up on some of these bigger challenges. And of course, aware of some of the tensions inherent in this. We know aquariums are not kind of, there's ethical questions around aquariums and that are well covered elsewhere. And whilst our project doesn't necessarily seek to directly kind of engage with the ethics of these spaces, I think what we have found is that they can play a really vital role in ocean citizenship, in cultivating ocean understandings, and in helping us to think through some very complex questions.
So, what about the biggest challenges so far in your work? What have you faced?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can take this out to the broad level and then zoom it in again. And on the broad level of talking about a human geographical study of the ocean, I think one of our biggest challenges has actually been being part of the effort to raise awareness of this field of research and to be part of the effort to kind of people the seas, if you will. There was a paper that came out by Stefan Partolo and colleagues quite recently, and he noted that only 7.4% of research in about marine spaces, 7.4% was social marine research. And I think this is quite worrying, and I think it stresses a challenge that I think we faced, and for disciplines like human geography, because we need funding and we need investment in the research that we do to be able to help our seas and oceans. Because, of course, if you think about it, who is it who can conserve, preserve, and restore our oceans? It's people. So we have to have understandings of how we govern, how we manage, how we control resources, who's doing that, why and in what interests, how we, to go back to Rachel's last answer, how do we build ocean stewardship and citizenship? That's all very people-oriented research. So I think one of the biggest challenges has been for our work is raising the awareness of people being really critical and crucial to how we understand ocean and marine spaces. And also a challenge to also understand that there aren't always quick answers to sort of building an understanding of our seas and then to solutions to some of the problems they may be facing. We know from our work in aquariums that there are long-term strategies for how they curate their tanks, how they engage with their messaging and the messages that they put out. And these are long-term things. And so the same goes for governance. It takes a very long time to put measures to protect our ocean into place. So those are some of the challenges. And I think Rachel has a few more that have been quite specific, I think, zooming in then to our specific project, not just our work in the wider area of sort of ocean geographies.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking one of the, I think, challenges that we've had, and perhaps perhaps I've internalized this a little bit, but is thinking about aquariums as serious spaces. Because I think when you say, oh, you're doing a project on aquariums, it can sound quite not very serious. It sounds fun, which it has been really fun. But it also has a much more serious side to it. And we've touched upon that with the amount of visitors that go through these spaces, the way they represent and curate the oceans. But I think part of it has been kind of putting a stake in the ground, saying, yes, we should be looking at these spaces as geographers. They're important, they matter, and they function in particular ways that shape people's geographical imaginations really, really powerfully. And also thinking about how they exceed their confines as well. So a lot of the aquariums we visit do amazing projects in the local areas in which they're in. It could be restoring seagrass, it could be investing in conservation projects, all kinds of ways that they function, which I think people are perhaps not necessarily aware of. So I'd say that's been a challenge in the specifics of the project.
Lovely, thank you. And so on the flip side, what about the successes?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, the biggest success has been Rachel saying she found the projects that we work on together fun. So I'm very glad, Rachel, that you've enjoyed our collaboration. No, working with Rachel is really, really great. And that, huge success has been getting this project funded, actually, because I think that also demonstrates its importance to the sorts of things that we're doing. And it shows us how this kind of research matters to, how such spaces like aquariums can be fundamental to thinking about positive ocean change in the future. So that's been a big success. I could talk about many more different successes that mainly relate to the wonderful people who I work with, but I'll hand over to Rachel, I think.
Yeah, I think in our kind of earlier discussions prior to this podcast, I think one of the things we reflected on as a success of the project is how it's prompted us to think in very different ways and prompted us to challenge ourselves, I guess, with different questions. So, for example, I came in with very fixed ideas, I guess, about aquariums as catering to particular audiences, for example, families. But what we found is that a number of aquariums are doing amazing work, engaging elderly people and older people, taking VR headsets into care homes, for example. Hopefully Freya, who will join us on our next podcast from the National Marine Aquarium, will talk about that in more detail. Engaging people with diverse needs, making oceans accessible, because we've talked about them being inaccessible, but there's much wider questions about accessibility and, who can physically actually go over sand and get to the sea, who can enjoy a beach, for example, or a coastal location. And aquariums often do a lot of work engaging neurodiverse people with accessibility needs, and of course young people feature in that as well. So I think a real success for us personally has been to think about these spaces differently and to think about the people of aquariums and the people who can enjoy these spaces and learn from them in different ways as well.
Wonderful. The big theme that's come out here is that this is about people making decisions and people accessing the ocean through the aquarium. So if you're thinking specifically about your research, how do you feel it's going to reach the wider audience with that kind of people-centric and accessibility? What do you think it might look like?
Oh, well, we're really excited. Firstly, hopefully through things like this podcast. Hopefully there'll be a second podcast, and we're also working with the RGS and with Rachel and Simon to create some resources for schools so we can start bringing these questions into the classroom in hopefully exciting ways, and that get people to think about these spaces differently and with people, as you say, at the centre. So we're really excited to be engaging with that process and to be thinking about the intersections between classrooms, aquariums, and some of the work we've been doing. And I'm sure Kim will say a bit more. We're also really interested in reaching kind of policy audiences and thinking about these questions in different ways.
Yes, many people may well be aware who are listening to this that we are in the middle of something called the United Nations Decade for Ocean Science, or the UN Ocean Decade, which is a decade-long activity sponsored by the United Nations to get people engaged in oceans and ocean science. And this all comes together with a number of there are very big policy interventions that are happening around our seas and oceans right now. Some listeners may also be aware that in 2023, we had a brand new a legally binding treaty related to our oceans and for governing bits of our oceans in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so essentially what I'm getting at here is that policies around the oceans are part of how we think about our oceans. We look after our oceans, and we can think about the kinds of futures that we want to enact within our seas and oceans and those spaces, how we might look after them, care for them, who's doing that. And one thing that we want to do is to share our research with relevant agencies who may be able to learn about the research we're doing and how it might help them. So the UN Ocean Decade, one thing that it's very interested in is how we engage the wider public to care about the ocean, something that Rachel's talked about already. How can you build ocean literacy, ocean stewardship, ocean citizenship? And it's our hope that we'll actually write a policy brief from this research that will actually tell people how aquariums can help do that, and that will be directed both towards aquariums. How can aquariums better do that or continue to do that? But also, how can we inform policymakers of the work that aquariums can do to help display important messaging around the future of our oceans? So that policy dimension is really important, and it's important, as I mentioned, at a moment at which ocean policy is big business right now. And I could say more about that, but it is a really important area of thinking about our ocean futures. So there's a whole range of ways that we can engage with wider audiences, both through audiences such as schools, such as everyday people, but also with policymakers who may be involved in decision making that helps to create things such as ocean citizenship and improve literacy.
So from your perspective, what is the most pressing issues or research priorities concerning our understanding of oceans today? I know you've talked about the UN Ocean Decade, but for you, what is the priority?
For me personally, I think it's that we have more human-centred research and research that's quite complex. So I want to go back to that term ocean literacy for a moment. This term is very popular at the moment, but we also have to understand what it means to be ocean literate and who can be ocean literate. The word literate means to be able to read and write. And of course, also many people in our world may have other modes and ways of understanding. And so actually what I would like to see is lots of critical work on thinking about human relationships to the sea and thinking about how varied they are. So, I always ask, is ocean literacy the right term? Should we be using that? Or is it ocean understandings? Might that be better? So I would like to see more human-centered research. I think that's the big research priority, and also in critical and varied ways. So, for example, some of the work that I do or that my team does here in Germany, as I mentioned, where I work, is we also think about the ways in which we might preserve and restore the oceans using particular management techniques and mechanisms. And sometimes we might think they're good, like we might think it might be good to protect a zone of the ocean. But what if in protecting that zone of the ocean, we lock out or remove some of the people who've traditionally always fished there? That creates a problem. So I think there needs to be more people-centered research. And likewise with our aquarium project, as Rachel said, yes, we're really interested in how they use messaging, how they can help alert us to some of these big environmental issues and how they do that through the various techniques that they use. But also one thing that we're also interested in is what messages are they using? So there's such an emphasis on plastics, for example, that we might forget some of the other critical issues. We might focus on some specific species that we forget about the kind of boring ones that actually might be really essential to the ecosystem. So I think we need to have more critical research and more human-centered research, and those are really the pressing priorities. There are, of course, specific areas that we could focus on. Seabed mining, for example, is probably quite a critical, specific issue. But on a broader level, I think more research about people and people's relationships with the ocean and more critical research about those things.
Yeah, definitely. And I would, just echo many of those points. I think for me, there would be, alongside those very issue-specific things, like Kim said, around deep-sea mining, or we could be thinking about the geopolitics of the South China Sea, all of these kinds of really pressing things that are emerging around us as we speak. I think there's some really interesting questions to be asked about the people that we do research, whether that is the need, as we've talked about briefly, to decolonise understandings of ocean geographies, to think more proactively with Black, Brown, Indigenous scholarship. My colleague here, Vandana Desai, wrote a paper in 2017 about how geography is a very white discipline. And I think the most recent data shows that very little has changed within that. So I think there's more work definitely to be done across that area, but also thinking about different demographics, I guess. So I think often, Kim might correct me here, but I think often in ocean geographies, there's like a core group of people that we might think about, but we never really think about children, for example. We never think about the role that TV programs like The Octonauts have in kind of shaping children's understandings of ocean geographies. Or historian Helen Rozwadowski has written some work about play and the role of kind of playing in kind of forging relationships with the oceans in really interesting ways. And then I think at the other end of the spectrum, as we've kind of touched on already as well, thinking with elderly people, what does memory, how does memory of the ocean become a really important thing? So a couple of the people we spoke to who work with older people found that when they gave elderly people a VR headset, or if they took elderly people from a local care home, for example, to the aquarium, it prompted all kinds of reflections, reminiscing, and memories of the ocean that people had previously kind of forgotten. So how can we be thinking with these different ends of the age spectrum, I guess, as well, within these questions?
So finally, where can our listeners find out more about your work?
Yeah, so we have just launched a really exciting project website, which is called Indoor Oceans. So it's literally indoor-oceans.com, where you'll be able to read more about the project, and we're building up a kind of set of resources on there as well. So any talks that we've done, any briefs, policy briefs that we write will make their way onto that website. So please do check that out for further information.
And of course, you can find out more about us at our institutional website. So Rachael is based at Royal Holloway, which we mentioned at the start of this podcast. And I'm based at the Helmholtz Institute for Functional Marine Biodiversity in Germany, as I mentioned a couple of times. And we also have a website that's full of fun things, actually, including all the different marine biodiversity work that we do. So people are more than welcome to find out more about me and about us there.
Wonderful. Rachael, Kim, thank you both for your time today. It's been a pleasure to find out more about this area of geography, and we're very much looking forward to more developments in the future.
Thank you for having us and for asking such thought-provoking questions.
Yeah, it's been great.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to the Ask the Geographer podcast series on soundcloud.com or your preferred streaming platform. Dive deeper into the world of geography and stay informed with our wide range of resources, many of which are available for free. School membership grants access to even more resources, including online lectures and supporting materials for both teachers and learners. Explore our resources and discover our additional offers for education at www.rgs.org/schools.